lecture material is a little bit technical, but very important for your understanding of economics. Particularly, we call this subject economic growth accounting. And growth accounting is the decomposing economic growth by input factors and things like that. It's a little bit technical, but very important subject for all of you to understand. Okay, so let me start continuing from the discussion that we had last week. We started from 왼쪽 거지 이거는. Let me share the chapters. Right. Okay. So we were just about to begin the impact of Japanese colonialism on the Korean economy. As you probably have learned from the readings of Mason textbook, from 1910 to 1945, Korea Peninsula was under the Japanese colonialism. And in the year of 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, basically Allied forces of United States and Soviet Union from the north side, from southern side, U.S. forces. During this almost 35 years of occupation by Japan, there was a profound impact by Japanese colonialism on Korea. In retrospect, there are many historians who are making some positive analysis and saying that this colonial period was the beginning of Korea's modernization effort. On the other hand, there are other scholars, as usual, who are anti-Japanese colonialism and saying that Korean people were deprived of the opportunity to develop on their own. In other words, we call this type of endogenous capitalist system or endogenous socialist system. Either way, Korea could not have opportunity to develop, to modernize itself by themselves, So always pros and cons, as usual. Vigorous Korean military and political resistance followed, but Japanese suppression to wipe out Korea's national and cultural identity, Japanese names and language were forced. Antipathy toward the Japanese became very deep-rooted in Korea. Now, even in modern Korea, you may have heard of sort of comfort woman issue, or war reparation issue, all these things still ongoing between Korea and Japan. So that kind of deep-rooted antipathy toward the Japanese is still existing in the Korean society. For Korea's rapid economic growth, Japanese colonial rule cannot be seen as just unrelieved disaster. Korean standard of living declined in both absolute and relative terms during the colonial rule, but it laid key foundations for Korea's later modern economic growth. At this point, I personally think that Korea's development was deeply affected by Japanese institutions. You know, these days, economists are paying a lot of attention and putting a lot of emphasis on the development of institutions. When we say institutions, it could be formal institution, and at the same time, it could be informal institutions like customs, practice, like contract system, or property ownership system, like registration system. All these kind of government-related patent system, government-related tax system, all these required institutions, customs, contracts cannot be built overnight. Somehow, one of the great sort of assets left by Japanese colonial government, wantingly or not wantingly by the Korean people, Japan tried to impose their mainland system in the form of, imperial government. So government tax system, government expenditure system, and government sort of court system, even police system, security system were imposed on Korean Peninsula. And that was inevitable key foundations for the Korea's later modern economic growth. This is kind of under the control of Japanese government general of Korea. In Korean, we say Joseon Chongdokbu. Government general is translated in the government general office of Korea, for example, Chongdokbu. And students were forced to make rice bags, for example. This is the scene. Namdaemun-ro is kind of, if you have ever visited Seoul, you know South Gate, Namdaemun Gate. And near Namdaemun Gate, this is main entry port, entry area to the city of Seoul from suburban, for example, South Korean cities and towns. You go through this town. So this Namdaemun-ro, Southgate area was very booming area, very busy area. You know, you can see the, 1890s picture left. Very countryside, country-like. Almost no signs of urbanization. 1930s, right in the middle of a colonial period. You see here, this is near Namdaemun-ro, now Southgate. Southgate is located here. And you can see the, placard and, the symbols of Japanese word, like all these platforms and placard in Japanese. So that's what this was the period of right in the middle of Japanese colonialism. Okay, this is the first Western hotel in Korea, the Chosun Hotel, built in 1914. Okay, I have chosen my wedding ceremony be held this by Western Hotel, Western Chosun Hotel. So I remember this picture, back almost 40 years ago, I was married in this hotel. So this is kind of very prestigious first Western hotel in Seoul. The right-hand side picture is Supung Dam was constructed by Japanese between 1937 and 1943. So in North Korea, North Korea. Supung Dam was sort of water power, hydropower power plant, and that is the symbol of industrialization in North Korea. So in terms of industrialization, North Korea was a little bit better off, ahead of South Korea, even during the Japanese colonial period. Okay. So this shows production in Korea under Japanese rule. Production was very briefly increased between 1920 to 19 roughly 30, and then a little bit stagnated. And toward the end of 1940, sharply increased due to preparation for war, for example, industry and agriculture, or everything was sharply increased. But toward the end of 1945, like 1940s, early 1940s, due to war preparation, agriculture was declined and industry declined and so forth. This shows the interesting story which was going on in Korean Peninsula. And in terms of percentage of industrialization, for example, industry became increasing throughout this period. So Japanese colonial government made some effort to industrialize Korean factories and manufacturing sector in particular. Okay. Railway, telephone subscription was all on the rise as a consequence of Japanese colonialism. Japanese government general economic growth was substantial under Japanese government general between 1910 to 1945. You can check with your table. Manufacturing growth over 10% a year, very rapid manufacturing growth. Agricultural growth 2%, relatively insignificant. According to Korean scholar Ban, he estimates lower estimates, like 1.6%. Gross material product and GNP growth about 4% a year. Population growth about 1.6%. So per capita commodity product about 2% growth. Similar rate in Japan, one of the world's finest, fastest growing nations at the time. So remember, always whenever you have a GDP accounting here, 4%, if you deduct population growth, even though here per capita commodity product is about 2.2%, to be more exact, 4% minus 1.6%, it should be 2.4% growth, okay? So to be more exact, it should be 2.4% growth. You usually deduct GDP growth rate from GDP growth rate, population growth rate, then you have per capita GDP growth rate. So To be more exact, it should have been written as 2.4%, because 4% minus 1.6% gets you 2.4%. Okay. Japanese intended to serve the economic needs of Japan, of course, not those of Korea. So in 1940, 94% of authorized manufacturing capital in Korea was owned by Japanese. Key sectors such as metals, chemicals, gas, electrical appliances were Japanese. Korean firms were much smaller and financially weaker. Out of 1,600 Korean technicians in 1944, but only 19% of all was Koreans. 81% were Japanese, for example. So upper class, upper level engineers and experts position were occupied by Japanese, of course, residing in Korea, roughly about 20% Korean technicians. But remember, this 20% is important because this is the technicians who later became engineers and top class middlemen after World War II, 1945. So those technicians, roughly 20% of Japanese style trained technicians, were main core force of technological engineers after 1945, when South Korea became, starting developing their own development plans. So still, this 20% is better than 0%, So that means even though upper class engineer class were occupied by Japanese, but this colonialization probably planted seeds for industrialization in later period, Korea's industrialization. So by 1947, the number of manufacturing construction establishments fell from about 10,000 to about 4,500. Employment declined 41%, and manufacturing output was only 15% of 1939. So, in other words, the departure of Japanese engineers and professionals left Korea in vacuum, empty place. But what I want to point out is, even though employment declined by 41%, that means about 60% remained, right? Manufacturing output was only 15% of 1939 level after Japanese departure, but still that 15% is better than 0%, no percent, right? So even though South Korea and North Korea had to start from almost scratch, 1945, but still the legacy, the foundations laid out by Japanese colonial government, colonial rule, was formidable to my judgment, okay? Of course, division of Korean Peninsula, as we observed last week, Korean War and loss of Japanese markets and people, little of importance was left over from the Japanese colonial rule. But again, I said, institutions were left behind. Police officers were left behind. Tax officers left behind. All the contracts and government books were left over. Of course, ownership and physical capital was misleading, but considerable expansion in Korean factory labor force from 12,000 in 1912 to 300,000 in 1940, from 23.5 million population. That's a very formidable expansion in factory labor force. Korea began its independence with a substantial cadre of experienced workers. In other words, Korea started from some decent number of substantial cadre of experienced workers out of colonialism. There was a large immigration into Japan, about 2 million people in Korea, in Japan by 1945, over 1 million in Manchuria, Japanese-held territory, and rapid urbanization during the colonial period can be seen. Koreans in Japan received higher wages, and residents in cities modern sector employed are the stock of human capital for post-independence economic development. Educational base of traditional Korea was much stronger than many other pre-modern societies. Japanese expanded primary level education to integrate Korea into the Japanese Empire. So the Korean wording, this integration, we called 내선일체. 내 means interior, 선 means chosen, then Korea's name. So 내 means mainland Japan, 선 means Korean peninsula, 일체 means one body. So let's get mainland Japan and Korean peninsula to become one body. In other words, one nation. That under that slogan, Japanese Empire tried to accommodate and integrate Korea into Japanese Empire. The number of common schools means primary schools, increased from 306 in 1911 to 715 in 1921, almost doubled, and to 2,600 ultimately by 1937. One common school for each of 22,493 townships. So in other words, primary education expansion was the key factor under Japanese colonialism. This primary school education paid back ultimately to Korea's modern development in later years. Of course, Japan expanded this primary education not only for the Korean people, but for the sake of Japanese integration policy to integrate mainland Japan with Korea. But again, even though that could be the sole purpose of Japanese expansion policy of primary education, ultimately primary education expansion paid back to the modernization of Korea. By 1937, 900,000 pupils, over 1 million by 1945, educated. So relatively, Korea by 1945, with a relatively higher literacy rate. Illiteracy rate was not that high due to primary school expansion during the colonial period. In 1921, 157,000 pupils in common schools with still 203,000 enrolled in traditional schools, a total nearly half of 1937. So you can see here, traditional schools were still formidable educational facility, educational institution. Traditional schools we used to call 서당. 서 means books, 당 means house. It's virtually book house. So in 서당, book house, village students were enrolled in traditional schools. So some of the families were so against Japanese colonialism, they did not send their children, their kids, pupils, to modern Japanese school system, but they sent their children to traditional school, 서당, to be independent to some extent. And so almost half and half coexisted. Traditional schools and modern common schools coexisted by 1937. That's what it says. Of course, ultimately, after 1937, almost all traditional schools disappeared and became integrated into modern common schools laid out by Japanese colonial government. The educational pyramid narrowed but not disappeared. Tens of thousands in high schools and thousands more in universities in Korea or Japan, but with a severe discrimination against Korean admittance. For example, institutional development, representatively the finances of government, as I said, tax revenue, expenditure, monitoring, a modern monetary system, Bank of Korea and commercial banks were developed, a railroad between Seoul and Busan to Manchuria and Europe even, a high quality extension service in rural areas to supply Japan's demand for inexpensive rice in rural areas. Talking about this Seoul, Busan to Manchuria and Europe railroad system, recently Korean government tried to improve the railroad connection from Seoul to Pyongyang and Sinuiju through North Korea, but again the North-South relationship did not improve that much, and under United Nations sanctions and all these complexities. So this railroad is just sitting, but not heavily utilized all the way to Manchuria and Europe. But Korea's monetary and banking system reverted to 1910 system, and general deforestation followed to some extent. Yes. But something of value was retained. The rural extension system, for example, the Bank of Korea from the old Bank of Chosen, and other special banks for agriculture and industry. Mostly, of course, these special banks were public banks, government-owned banks, but for agricultural development, for industrial development, separate purpose, special purpose, public banks were established during the colonialism. Academic excellence in Seoul National University and private universities of Yonsei and Korea University continued to exist. Of course, Seoul National University was a part of government university, but Yonsei and the Korea University was a very wonderful university. And it is surprising to note the establishment of privately funded university started to exist from colonial period. Yonsei University was established by missionaries from America and kept being funded by missionaries and later became a very private university. Korea University was more sort of traditional landlord group. His name was Kim. Kim family, a rich family, founded this Korea University. So this Korea University is more kind of endogenous university, so to speak. Uh, these two universities are prestigious private universities, still existing and attracting a lot of students, good students. Of course, Seoul National University, which I belong to, was imperial university under colonialism. Then it became separate, independent public university, of course, government-owned university. Korea as a source of cheap rice and as a place for Japan's surplus population. This should be noted because Korea was a source of relatively cheap rice. Price of rice from Korea was about 1/3 of Japanese rice price. So what they did, Korea exported rice to Japan to feed their industrializing labor, surplus population. In return, they could import cheaper barley and corns, other non-rice materials to feed general Korean population. So this kind of, there was a kind of terms of trade sort of uh, dispute or discrimination. But again, that was the only way Korea could support their population by exporting expensive rice, in return importing cheaper non-rice items to feed their population. Land survey and take over all land in the public domain to some extent. Steady conversion from farmer-owned and tilled land to landlord-owned and the tenant-tilled land. In other words, this landlordship and tenant-tilled land, in other words, landlord versus tenant relationship was established. And to some extent, farm families who owned no land increased from 38% to 55%. About 17% of land farmed by tenants was owned by Japanese landlords. So relatively, Japanese landlords did not occupy that much of the land, only governed about 17%. So still about 80% of land was owned by Korean landlords and farmers, Korean, tenants. No income distribution data exists, but the large surplus of rural poor exists. In 1937, half of South Korean farm families farmed less than half of a hectare of land. Much of that land was owned by landlords. Half the main crop, or 1/4, 1/4 of total household income, became that kind of became 1/4 of their total household income. Depressing effect on urban wages. For example, from 1910 to 1944, almost 35 years, money wage increased 262%, about 2.5 times, lagging behind the rise in wholesale price index. Wholesale price index increased 115%. That means CPI, consumer price index, must have increased at higher rate. maybe 400% or 500%. So money wage increase was not recovering the WPI cost increase or CPI cost increase. So money was too weak to some extent. Real wages were depressed and decline in real wages, because real wages is money wages divided by WPI or CPI inflation rate. Okay. So despite a steady rise in average per capita national product, the income of half or more of population was declining in absolute terms. Land reform and unintended side effects of the Korean War followed. Land reform, as I recall, was administered in 1949 by occupied government. Was prepared by occupied government up until 1948. After South Korea established its own government, land reform was enacted in 1949. And therefore, Korea became very classless society after land reform. That means Korea started from very egalitarian state. And that's the one characteristic different from many other developing nations. Many other developing nations or underdeveloped world were always having division between two classes, landlords and farmers in everywhere. But that distinction, division between landlord and farmer became almost disappearing in case of South Korea. And of course, unintended side effects of Korean War means even though there was some rich families or rich assets, that got destroyed by Korean War. So this Korean War sort of accelerated egalitarian status of Korean society, and that became, foundation of Korea's modern development. Rising farm output with increasing tenancy, a major exporter of rice and other agricultural products, 1920s, 1930s, under colonialism. Foodstuffs accounted for 60% or more of Korean exports. Of course, in return, Korea imported a lot of raw materials and manufactured goods from Japan. From 1925 to 1939, 40% of Korea's total rice crop was exported to Japan, as I explained before, right? Korea's foreign trade sector was built on a foundation of inequality that collapsed when land was redistributed and farmers started consuming most of their own rice instead of giving it to the landlords who then sold it to Japan. Of course, this is the agricultural sort of revolution after 1945. Here is a very interesting statistics. For example, total population increased modestly from 1910 to 1941. Urban areas, percentage of over 100,000 city dwellers living urban areas. Urban population was only 2.6% in 1910, but after 1941, it became almost 10%. And of course, if we together over 20,000, it became from 5.8% in 1910, by 1941, about 20%. So by 1941, as a consequence of rapid urbanization during the colonial period, out of 100 people living in Korean Peninsula, about 20 people lived in the cities or urban area, like Seoul metropolitan city, Busan, Daegu, Pyongyang, that sort of stuff. So rapid urbanization statistics is very interesting statistic to note. Net value of commodity product, meaning that almost GDP concept. If you think of GDP concept, you can see here mining and manufacturing increasing annual rate 9.7%, almost 10%. Fastest growing pattern here. You can see also over time, you can divide each sub-period, and you can see agriculture, forestry, and fishery increased only 2.3%. Mining and manufacturing increased by almost 10%. That means during the colonialism, more emphasis was placed upon mining and manufacturing development under Japanese government rule. Tenant distribution before 1945. Farm families who are owners were 22%, 1918 at the beginning of colonial period, but it went down to 19% by 1937. How about tenants? Tenants ratio became increasing and owners ratio decreasing. That's the characteristic, we have looked at, commented. In other words, owner-tenant relationship became more strengthened during the colonial period. More owners, landlord group appeared. Of course, including these are farm families, Korean farm families. More owners were occupied by Japanese landlord groups, as we explained. Trade and income distribution, colonial period left Korea unstable. Political impact of Japanese rule, no management experience in running the country was possessed by Korean populace. So, for example, the no management experience was enjoyed by Koreans. Therefore, a lot of managerial work was occupied by Japanese. Lee dynasty's system was discredited and autocratic rule of the hated Japanese began. So country's division that followed was devastating after 1945 because most of the mines and half of the production output stayed in the north. Destruction of many lives and resources followed due to Korean War, 1950 and 1953. Political instability after 1945 until military coup of 1961. There was a big heritage of Japanese colonialism. Koreans were deprived of the opportunity to develop effective political institutions of their own. First, by colonialism. Second, by chaotic division of peninsula and division of North Korea and South Korea followed up until 1961. Okay. Unmitigated disaster, it was the division of the nation. The economy of Korean Peninsula split into two. South, about 2/3 of population and one half of arable land and 2/3 of the paddy acreages. North, most of mines and about one half of all manufacturing output and most of electricity facilities. considerable disruption, but pool of workers and technicians were left behind from colonial period. South Korea had to develop manufacture exports, while North Korea kept relying on mineral exports. Military budgets, 5% of GDP in South and about 20% of GDP in North. And confrontation between two divided nations and hostility continued. So comparison of land and population between South and North Korea at the time of division. And I always quote from these statistics. It's very important statistics whenever we talk about North Korea and South Korea and its division. You should pay attention to reading this table. And it is very important statistic that still we can rely on, because this statistic is so-called what I define initial condition of South Korean development and North Korean development. For example, population density, South Korea was much higher than North Korea. Population-wise, almost double the figure of South Korea from North Korea. All these things, please pay attention to these statistics, important statistics. Net commodity product we reviewed, all right? Composition of manufacturing production, for example, textiles, main item. South Korea had only 24% and North Korea only 4% out of their total product. On the other hand, if you look at, for example, gas and electricity products, North Korea occupies a lot higher percentage, okay? Conclusion. The Korean historical heritage was a very formidable, unified, and homogeneous population. Class structure had begun to erode during the latter half of Yi Dynasty and undermined by the Japanese colonial rule and by independence, land reform, and Korean War, made class structure become less apparent. In other words, Korean society became more egalitarian, equal society from the consequence of land reform and Korean War. Korea's population and agricultural output was made a steady increase with self-support. Confucianism, deep sense of education, and phonetic alphabets and primary school expansion are the cornerstones of later Korean development. Most serious negative features was isolation of Korea from international arena and the opportunity of ruling their own country. Okay. Now let us move to the next 공유중지가 어디 나오지? 안 나오네.
일단 창을 치워야 돼. 이거 드래그해서 내려가.
공유중지하고 화면공 요거지. So to some extent, up to lecture 3 and chapter 3, we have covered very rough overview of Korean sort of development. And including colonial period, right? So chapter 4 is the basically main economic development period. Particularly, we will take care of macroeconomic development. Political events, of course, this development covers only South Korean part. North Korean part, I hope I can add one session or two at the end of this semester. So you are looking at mostly South Korean development after 1953, after the ending of Korean War. Political events have repeatedly interrupted the Korean economic growth. 1945 until 1953, Korean development was nowhere. In other words, it was backwards, rural economy by 1953 after the Korean War. When the armistice, in other words, war was over, technically by truce, armistice, was signed in 1953, the level of production of Korean economy was far below what it had been during the early 1940s under the Japanese colonial rule. So Korean economy was deteriorating in terms of output level, in terms of income level from the colonial period because of chaotic, very confusing period, political events, North-South Korea division, and followed up by Korean War. Per capita GNP was only $134, one of the poorest nation in the world at 1970 constant prices. Output declined from 1939-40 net commodity product data, which was of course compiled by Japanese colonial government. Therefore, economic condition was terrible after 1945. So after the Korean War, South Korean government, then governed by Syngman Rhee, first president, Syngman Rhee government gave priority given to reconstruction of infrastructure. So in other words, of course, as you can see, reconstruction of infrastructure was necessary because all the roads, railroads, bridges were destroyed. And at the same time, South Korean economy was suffering from really high rate of inflation. Why? Why inflation? Because population was growing, but output was devastated by the Korean War. So agricultural product was not enough. Of course, manufactured products was not enough in terms of output level. So given very low level of production, more people are demanding for food and non-food manufactured products. So price goes up, like average inflation rate over 40 to 50%. So at that time, growth was secondary consideration for the government. Price stabilization was more important. So priority given to reconstruction of the infrastructure, at the same time, price stabilization policy. 1950s, large quantities of aid-financed food, medicines, machinery, and raw materials arrived in Korea. From United Nations, mostly by US, and 10% of GNP was foreign aid. Over 70% of Korea's imports were financed by foreign grants. So-called counterpart funds generated by the sales of grant aid dollars provided a non-inflationary sources of domestic currency financing for investment. So what they did, government received grants aid dollars and exchanged that into counterpart funds, Korean won, and used that to financing their investment and government needs. So almost half of all general government expenditure were financed out of these funds. So first and second, these two factors together, Korean economy, South Korean economy was very much dependent on foreign aid during this period, 1950s. Therefore, inward-looking industrial policy and import substitution policy in the 1950s was inevitable. And rather than outward-looking industrial policy and export promotion policy in the 1960s, you should understand this very carefully, and this is very important remark, in the sense that in the 1950s, typically what I would say is there are twin gaps. So twin gaps means 내가 이걸 고칠 수 있지, 텍스트를. 지금은 안 되니? Yeah. This import substitution, why import substitution was inevitable in 1950s? That time, one of the twin gaps we call twin gap theory. In other words, many early stages of developing nations, they suffer from two gaps. What is the first gap? First gap is foreign exchange gap. What is foreign exchange gap? They have more import demand than export earning. In other words, they cannot sell a lot of products. They do not have a lot of competitive export items. But on the other hand, they have to import a lot of fuel. They have to import a lot of farm products to feed their population. So always demand for import is exceeding in excess of supply of export. So foreign exchange earning is always in shortage, in deficit. That we call first gap. In other words, import minus export gap exists. The second gap in twin gaps we call savings minus investment gap. In other words, because of lower per capita income, they do not save, they do not have tendency towards save large amount. So their savings, domestic saving, always in short of investment need, but they have to spend a lot of money on bridge construction, railroad construction, electric power generators, a lot of manufacturing facilities. They need a lot of investment. On the other hand, their domestic supply of funds by savings is always in shortage. So there is a savings investment gap. That's the second gap. 1950s were characterized by these two gaps. So they could not have enough export earning, export promotion could not be made. So the only way to save on foreign currency, in other words, foreign convertible currency such as dollar, US dollar, is to substitute import. In other words, to make substitution of imports into domestic production so that they can save on foreign dollars, foreign exchange reserves. In other words, in the 1950s, they could not have any export promotion because they did not have enough dollars. Of course, only in 1960s, they slowly started to develop export promotion, and by earning on the dollars, they could pay for import items. So the official foreign exchange rate always overvalued despite large periodic devaluations. Why overvalued? Because they were always in short of export rather than import. So always Korean currency was overvalued despite large periodic devaluations. Government used high tariffs and quantitative restrictions to protect domestic industry for import substitution. Okay. Hyperinflation continued to exist. Wholesale price index dropped from 531% in 1951 to 25 to 28% in 1953, but rose again to 80% in 1955. So following the advice of US aid mission, eliminated large government deficit in 1957, reduced the money supply from 62% to 29% to control inflation. So they ultimately gained relative price stability. From 1950s, to overcome the scarcity of domestic resources, maximizing foreign assistance rather than domestic savings, that was the strategy. Post-war incomes were too low at that time. Interest rates on the organized financial markets means like regular banks interest rate were controlled low to accelerate private investment. To encourage private investment, government sort of depressed government-owned banks' interest rate so that more investment could be made. And aggregate domestic savings, not sensitive to interest rates. There was a large interest rate differential with the unorganized financial markets. That what we call private, non-organized financial markets, we call curve market rate. Okay, so the collapse of Syngman Rhee government in 1960, and the US government announced that assistance would be terminated in the near future, around 1960. And this part I already explained during my last lecture, the installation of military government and the shift from reconstruction, stabilization to rapid industrialization based on exports. First 5-year plan took off stage in 1965. Target growth rate for industrialization and self-sustaining growth turning to mobilization of domestic resources. So, for example, 1964, won was devalued by 50%. So if what is the usual devaluation effect? If $1 rate is from 131 per dollar to 255 won per dollar, almost doubled, then if you are export owner, now if you are making $1 export earning, you could go to the bank. Previously, you could get only 131, but now you are getting 261, double the figure. So exporters are, desperately searching for more export earning. So in other words, this devaluation encourages export earning, export promotion. On the other hand, from importer point of view, if you want to make import of $1 worth goods, previously you had to pay only 131 to the bank. Now you have to pay for $1, 261. So double the cost of import. So this devaluation usually causes import restraint. Import is discouraged. On the other hand, export is encouraged. So devaluation has export promotion effect. In 1965, unitary flat floating exchange rate system and doubled interest rate on deposit loans to increase voluntary private savings and discourage unproductive bank credits. This is unitary floating exchange rate system was adopted. It's kind of floating exchange rate system is everyday exchange rate changes floats. It is not fixed exchange rate system. So in other words, instead of devaluing all at once after 2 years or 5 years, you sort of devalue almost every year slowly to encourage export earnings, export promotion. And also interest rate was doubled to increase voluntary private savings. So private savers used to be, let's say, 10% interest rate, but now if interest rate is 20%, they have an incentive to save more and discourage unproductive bank credits. So if you are making a lot of loan borrowing, that will be discouraged by increased interest rate. So these are all stabilization policy adopted in the 1960s. Basic strategy of export-oriented industrialization continued throughout fourth development plan until 1981. Modification of agricultural policy was followed. Shift to a policy of high grain prices and initiating new community movement. We call that as Semaul Undong, Semaul means new village movement, to improve farm village environment and increase agricultural production and income. And that was laid out by President Park in the form of a new village movement to upgrade and improve farm village environment and rural agricultural production and income. Another modification was the return to the low interest rate policy in the early 1970s. Okay. Annual growth rate of GNP at 1970 prices increased from 4.1% to 9.6%. So, this is a very drastic, restructuring of Korean economy from lower growth state to very high growth state during this 1960-1976 period. In terms of per capita GNP growth, from 1.7% to 7.2%. You can see table 12. Yeah, this documents table 12. And share of GNP by industrial origin. For example, agriculture used to occupy 44% of GNP in 1953-55 period, but by 1975, only 25%. On the other hand, manufacturing used to be 10.5%. By 1975, 28%. So this shows rapid industrialization in South Korea. Fixed investment by industrial origin, you can see that fixed investment increased sharply in manufacturing and industry side. On the other hand, primary side, service side was relatively stagnant. You can see here. Exports were the real engine of growth in table, as shown in table 15. The annual export earning growth during 1962-1976 was 29%. And by 1975, exports totaled 30% of GNP. And they say that this is one of the world record high rate of export growth. Export earnings financed 30% of imports in the 50s, but more than 100% by 1975. So in other words, by 1975, Korea's twin gap was almost disappearing. A lot of improvements made in balance of payments. And also domestic savings increased due to export earnings being channeled into income increase. Higher income, people get to save more with increased interest rate. So they could, domestic saving could finance almost domestic investment. 1950s, 10% of GNP was gross domestic investment, and 70% was financed by foreign savings. But by 1975, 27% of GNP went to domestic investment. Domestic financing portion increased from 30% by 1974, 1976 to 100%. So almost complete investment need was raised by domestic financing. It used to be domestic saving was 3% of GNP in early 1960s. By 1974, 1976, 27%. So, this is a very important statistic because in many cases of Latin American development, for example, domestic savings did not pick up this much. Most of savings were coming in the form of foreign saving, foreign investment. So therefore, their facilities, factories, were owned not by domestic residents, domestic ownership, but by foreign owners. So that's the difference of the industrialization mode between Latin American countries and South Korea or Taiwan, for example, in East Asia, right? So this is expenditure on national product, trends in domestic savings rate, as I showed you. One interesting note is that throughout this period, business firms' domestic savings rates has increased very sharply. So that means from private savings, households rather than households, business firms' savings rate domestic saving rate increased very sharply. So this has given a lot of incentive to the development business firm, keep accumulating their wealth, their capital, and then making returns to their capital, and then they can save their returns and then increase their expenditure on investment. So this is another important statistic for you to note. In the year of 1957-1962, 4% growth in total employment per year, and structure of employment remained stable. Average annual growth rate of non-agricultural, including manufacturing, was similar to agricultural employment. 유진아, 거기 차 덮인 거 좀 떠주고 저거 히터 좀 켜라. 위에 거. In 1963, over 60% of total labor force was still engaged in agriculture and fishing, primary industry. Also, about 16% of urban labor force was unemployed. But after 1963, post-Korean War, children reached maturity. See table 1, for example, total population growth rate was 2.2%. Population 14 years old and over, growth rate, non-farm employment increased at 7.2% per year, while farm employment increased only by 1.3%. So the structure changed dramatically. Agricultural employment share declined from 63% to 45%, while manufacturing employment increased sharply from 8% to 21.3%. 저 차 뜨겁지? 알래. 거기다 좀 따르고. The structure changed dramatically, from looking at employment statistics, as I have explained, employment statistics of agricultural sector and manufacturing sector, right? This table complements all these employment by sector. Please pay attention to, for example, inflation rate also calmed down significantly. If you look at table 19, early years GDP deflator and inflation rate was almost like 14-15%, but it was coming down very slowly. After 1963, inflation became very much stabilized. Real wages in manufacturing remained stable until mid-1960s, but rose rapidly to double by the mid-1970s. That shows the demand for industrial labor increased. More factories were opened, more people were needed as workers, so their wage rate started to rise. The improvement in farm income was lower than the rise in urban real wages. So a lot of people were coming from out of farm into manufacturing sector. That is migration from farm to manufacturing sector. Real interest rates on bank deposits and loans were negative in 1963-1964, years of high inflation. What is real interest rate? Real interest rate means nominal bank notified interest rate. Suppose real interest rate, nominal interest rate was 10%. If inflation rate is 5%, you deduct inflation rate much from nominal interest rate. So in that case, real interest rate becomes 5%, 10% minus 5%. But real interest rate could be negative. If nominal interest rate was only 10%, suppose high inflation like 15%, then 10% minus 15% real interest rate becomes negative. But due to 1965 interest rate reforms, what did they do? They increased nominal interest rate. And also relative price stability came through. Price inflation rate was coming down. So as a consequence, the real interest rate, previously negative one, became positive and rose to 10 to 15%. What is the significance of this phenomena? If real interest rate becomes positive and keep on rising, then a lot of savers have incentive to put their money into the bank. So less reliance on foreign import or foreign investment. They can rely more on domestic saving, domestic investment. So this becomes very virtuous circle. Okay. And as you can see, inflation rates in terms of consumer price index was very high during late 1950s, 30%, calmed down significantly. Okay. Sources of growth. This is the actually most technical part, but let me start this sources of growth, factors of production next week, so that I can answer for your questions with some time. So please read in advance this part, sources of growth, factors of production, very important part to understand this whole thing. I want you to read the textbook, this part first, to be prepared for my lecture next week, okay? So I'll stop here and answer for your questions up to this part, all right?
I have a question.
Okay, who is Evgeny?
Evgeny Tishchenko,
Yeah,
PhD student.
Tishchenko, okay.
Yeah. Is there a linear correlation between one devaluation and foreign investments? I can't understand why devaluation. We have in macroeconomic theory such instrument as currency bought. Why between $1 and dollar? Why devaluation in lower interest rates?
Okay, so at the beginning of each nation's development, as I said, there is a lot of investment need, right? Demand for investment is very high. You need to construct a lot of roads, factories, automobiles, and you need to construct a lot of facilities, for example. So government wants to have a very low interest rate so that investors find it more attractive to invest. If interest rate is very low, their borrowing cost is very low. So a lot of investors would like to have low interest rate. But on the other hand, if you look at the other side of the coin, low interest rate means for domestic savers, okay, if the current interest rate is only 2%, that means if you save $100, you are getting back at the end of year only $2 back. So a lot of case savers are turning away from domestic market domestic institutions, and putting their money into foreign dollars, foreign countries. Okay, for example, capital flight can happen. In other words, a lot of savers are turning away from domestic savings institution and put their money into foreign dollar, foreign countries. So we call that phenomena capital flight. All right. Of course, a lot of countries are forbidding, controlling capital flight. But again, there are very little incentive for domestic savers under very low interest rate. Okay. So what typically happens is it's understandable that we keep the domestic interest rate at low level at the beginning. But as the economy recovers, starts to develop, at some point, government needs to raise interest rate. Okay, raise interest rate to attract more domestic savings. Okay, that is, of course, a very crucial stage. And what happens also is, I mentioned in my slide, unorganized market and organized market. It's like once, for example, in your foreign exchange market, very, very old days, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I heard even in Moscow or in Russia, there was a black dollar market. Okay, official exchange rate between dollar and ruble could be $1 by 5 ruble, for example. But in unorganized market, black market, it could be, instead of $1 5 ruble, it could be $1 10 ruble. Okay, then people put their money not in official market, official bank, but in black market, right? So in other words, this discrepancy between organized market and unorganized market becomes almost intolerable at some point. Then the economy is ruined. So at some point, you have to make adjustment. Okay, that adjustment is like interest rate the same. It's like a black market interest rate is what we call unorganized market. Okay, I don't know, in Russia there is unorganized interest rate market. There are many developing countries, like in India or anywhere, there are unorganized interest rate market. We call shock market or shock interest rate. They charge like 30% overnight or 50% annual interest rate. Instead, while official interest rate is 5%, 2%. So these are symptoms of less development to some extent. So as the economy becomes normalized, the interest rate differential becomes less pronounced. And again, in order to attract a lot of domestic savings, at some point, government needs to equalize private market rate into official market rate at some point. Not immediately, but at some point. That's normalization of economic activity, right? So that's the reason why you have observed two discrepancies. Yes. Any other question?
Thank you.
I have a question.
Right.
Good evening. My name is Natalia Svetnik from Irkutsk.
Oh, yeah, Natalia.
Natalia. Question. Why project of domestic industries in Korea was not disturbed receiving foreign finances, foreign grants?
Right. Okay, a lot of Korean firms, Korean investment were made from Japanese or American investors, mostly in technology intensive industries. For example, automobiles, where Korean firms need technology, right? So usually investment is not just investment of money. That investment of money usually is conditional on technological transfer to some extent. So for example, General Motors investing Daewoo Automobile Company. Once Ford company tried to invest, Toyota tried to invest. Of course, Toyota deal did not materialize. So that's why Hyundai and Kia, all domestic firms, try to mobilize their funds, because if they rely on foreign firms, foreign investment, but then at the beginning it is easier for them to establish a plant, but later they felt that they will be dependent on foreign technology and foreign investment. But again, at the beginning of technological transfer, they need to get the foreign investment. So for example, some electronics industry, some shipbuilding industry, a lot of Japanese and technological know-how and technological Japanese investment, and also in automobile industry, those so-called strategic industries, they need not only foreign investment, but also foreign technology. Usually foreign investment comes with foreign technology combined, okay? So that's how they started their domestic industries. Okay, Elinio?
Thank you.
Natalia? Yeah. Any other question? Eugene, I'm sorry. 장을가 교수님 한국말로 해주셔도 좋고 질문 있으시면은 영어로 해주셔도.
없습니다, 교수님. 없습니다. 감사합니다.
그럼,
강의해 주셔서.
네. TSU니까 Tomsk State University죠.
네, 네, 맞습니다.
Tomsk State University, which university is bigger, Tomsk or Irkutsk? Which one is bigger? Almost the same size?
잘 모르겠어요.
Okay. Maybe Evgeny Tischenko, you can answer to my question. Evgeny.
Tomsk is bigger.
Huh?
Tomsk
Tomsk is bigger?
bigger
Yeah.
than Irkutsk.
Yeah. More population living in Tomsk area?
No, Tomsk is a student capital of Siberia, not Irkutsk.
I see.
Tomsk.
I see. Okay. That answers. Yeah. Any other question? Okay, here is my request. Growth accounting technique is most important and very important topic which will appear in your midterm exam. So I want you to read in advance, okay? Growth accounting part that I left behind for next week's lecture. Please, in chapter 4, growth accounting part, please read again and again and try to understand the numbers. Why the numbers appearing on that table, each table and so forth. If you read in advance and if you study in advance, that will be a great help to understand my next week lecture, okay? So please read chapter 4, growth accounting part, different numbers, different tables. Please study in advance, okay? That's my request to all of you, okay? Any other question?
Okay.
Christina? Safia
No,
Nova?
I haven't question.
Okay. Christina, do you have a question? No? Okay, then again, as usual, you can send me your personal question or request, anything, to my email number. I hope all of you share my email number, and please do not hesitate to ask any bold question, any interesting comments. Please share with my email number, and my student assistant research TA, Miss Bean Eugene Bean. She is very kind to all of you. So please do not hesitate to send her your question or your comments. Okay? 장은가 교수님 참석해 주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. Many thanks for your attendance. Okay? So I will see you next week. Thank you.
네, 교수님 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
감사합니다, 교수님.
네,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
다음 주
Thank you so
뵙겠습니다.
much.